This is the Greece and Persia test review. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just casually go through these questions and share my thoughts on them. If you want more depth, you can always go to the numbers of the various presentations that these questions come from. It would be a very good idea to go through this to prepare yourself for our Greece and Persia test. So the first question, describe the first Greek civilization. Well, what was the first one? We talked about the Minoans on the island of Crete. We talked about the sports that they had, such as the bull jumping sport, that nobody is really sure exactly how they did it. We talked about all the trade they did, and we also talked about how that civilization collapsed very mysteriously, and we talked about how we really can't read any of their writing. They left behind lots of writing. We just don't know what it says. And then the next question is describe the culture and politics of Athens. The big word there to know is democracy, and we're going to talk more about that in a later question. Not to mention such cultural aspects as their sculpture, their architecture, for example, the Parthenon, which there's a picture of it right there, and their plays, for example. They came up with drama, including tragedy and comedy. Their philosophy. They had a Greek golden age, which displayed advances in mathematics and physics and technology. Next question, describe the culture and politics of Sparta. Sparta couldn't be more different from Athens. Instead of a democracy, Sparta had an oligarchy, which we'll define in a minute. They also had a very warlike, very militaristic culture. They did not engage in art. They did not engage in literature or philosophy. So where did the Greeks get their alphabet? Keep in mind that the Greeks got their alphabet from a people that they traded with called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, and they were a sea trading people who traded far and wide. And what do we call this writing system that they used? That writing system was called phonetics. It was named after the Phoenicians. And in that writing system, and we have the very same type of writing system, we also have a phonetic alphabet or a phonetic writing system hooked on phonics. Worked for me, remember that? And the symbols in our writing system and theirs represent human sounds rather than concepts, and this makes the entire writing system much more concise and much easier to learn because you don't have to memorize hundreds or thousands of characters. And so who were these Greek philosophers that we studied? Keep in mind there were many Greek philosophers. We only focused on 3. And the first philosopher that we focused on was Socrates. Socrates emphasized truth. He emphasized the Socratic method in which you pose questions to your students and have your students learn by thinking out the answers to these questions. He was a strong proponent of education. He himself was a teacher. And he opposed the Peloponnesian War between the cities that followed Athens and the cities that followed Sparta. He was actually poisoned by the Athenian government. He was sentenced to drink hemlock because of his opposition to the Peloponnesian War. He was the one that said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And so that was Socrates. His student, another thing about Socrates is that we have none of his writing at all. Everything we know about Socrates, his life, what he taught, his philosophy, we know through Plato. And some of that could be wrong. Maybe Plato didn't exactly understand everything that he wrote himself about Socrates. But Plato was a student of Socrates. He believed in philosopher kings, and he wrote about that in a book that he wrote called The Republic. He also talked about Platonic realism, the idea that there were non-physical concepts, for example, numbers and perfect shapes, that exist in some part of our universe that we haven't really defined yet. They're outside the physical world, but they're also outside of our minds. They exist independently of our minds. And so he talked about that. Then we have Aristotle. Aristotle was actually a student of Plato, and he was a teacher of Alexander the Great. One of some of the things that Aristotle stood for was the classification and the analysis and methodical study of physics and the natural world. He wrote a book called Politics, in which he kind of scientifically studied and compared various political systems, and his views on physics and the natural world and science were standard for centuries. And so that's the Greek philosophers. In general, what did philosophy teach us about our world? And what philosophy stressed was that there is a truth out there somewhere, an objective truth. And we humans can get to that truth, and we can find that truth and discover that truth through observation and reason. This next question is, describe how the democracy actually worked in Athens. Who got to vote? And keep in mind that you had a body of citizens called the Democratic Assembly. They met periodically and they voted on all decisions. It was what we call a direct democracy. But only free Athenian men could be citizens and therefore could be part of that Democratic Assembly. It accepted no women, no slaves, and no foreigners. And so it left a lot to be desired. It was far from a perfect system, far from a perfect democracy, but at least it was a start. So what is a democracy? Well, that's a Greek word, and it simply means rule by the people. What is an oligarchy? That means rule by a few. And that is the kind of government that Sparta had. Sparta had two kings. Typically, one king was at home taking care of the city, and one king was out in the field engaged in warfare. So a city-state. Students have trouble with this. We learned what a city-state was back when we studied Mesopotamia. But a city-state is a city which is its own independent country. It has its own government. Nobody tells it what to do. So how was Greece's political development impacted by its geography? Well, keep in mind that the country of Greece, it's not, when we say country, I'm talking about that as a geographical expression, not an actual politically unified country, right? But Greece is very mountainous and very hard to get around in. And that makes it difficult to unify the whole area because travel and communication are both so difficult. And hence, that gave rise to the emergence of all of these various independent city-states, each of which had the freedom to experiment with different forms of government. And hence, that's where you came up with, democracy or other kinds of government. It was that freedom and that latitude to experiment independently of other city-states. So how was Greece's economic development impacted by its geography? Well, keep in mind that rocky, mountainous soil cannot grow much food. And so the Greeks had to rely on trade to get the food they needed. And everywhere in Greece has easy access to the sea, and that made trade easy. Next, identify 4 specific contributions that the Greeks made to art and architecture. Well, I can think of 4. Here's one. How about the Parthenon, their temple to Athena? That was an example of great architecture. Also, the Greeks made lots of decorative pottery that we still have today. Sculptures. In their sculptures of people, they sculptured the ideal beauty. They had to get the anatomy right. And they also had to get the humanity right. You could see emotions and things like that in Greek sculpture. And that is going to be imitated much later in the Renaissance. And of course, how about this contribution? Plays and theatrical masks. The Greeks came up with the concepts of tragedy and comedy. And in fact, the word hypocrite, the Greek word hypocrite, actually means to wear a mask, because in Greek theatrical convention, you wore a mask in front of your face when you were an actor, because you wanted your audience to know that, hey, that's not, you're not Frank up there, you're pretending to be somebody else. So you have a mask to let the audience know that, hey, I'm this other character. See my mask, right? I'm this other character. And so, what artistic values did the Greeks express in their architecture? In other words, what did the Greeks like to see in their buildings? And what they liked to see in their buildings was balance and harmony and symmetry. All of those were designed to express the Greek love for truth, and even more so, maybe even the Greek love for ideals. So they had a love for the ideal shape in the ideal forms and ideal structures, and that's how they designed their buildings and even their cities. So, how was Persia's political development impacted by its geography? Notice we kind of switched over to Persia. And keep in mind that the Persian Empire was huge. It encompassed 3 of our 4 river valley civilizations territories: the Nile, and Mesopotamia, and the Indus River Valley. So it was huge. And the king of Persia divided the empire into many different provinces, 20 actually to be exact, each run by a governor who was called a satrap, and each satrap reported directly to the king. Also, for good communication, they built the Royal Road with a very fast Pony Express system. How was Persia's economic development impacted by its geography? And notice we've got a picture of some Persian coins right there, silver coins. Like I said, the empire was huge. It was also very diverse. And so the Persians issued metal coins to standardize the currency for everyone. And that facilitated a much easier trade, because you had these coins as a way of facilitating trade, as a medium of exchange that everybody knew the value of. And so the next question: describe the Persian religion and what it taught. And remember, the religion that we associate with the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism taught this concept called dualism, in which good and evil were in continuous competition and conflict with each other. And we humans, each of us, has the obligation to choose a side. We can either choose the side of goodness and truth, or the side of evil and lies. And what we choose will impact how we are judged in the next life. And so that's Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism was also very much against slavery. So how did the Persian Empire treat the other cultures within its bounds, within its territory? And the answer is, and this was very much a unifying factor that kept the Persian Empire together, and that was the main thing with tolerance. Think of how tolerance and respect for other cultures and other religions. Think of how Cyrus the Great and other Persian kings treated the Jews, allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland, Israel, and even funded the rebuilding of vital structures in the Jewish city of Jerusalem. Describe a cause of the Persian Wars. Keep in mind what happened was your Ionian Greeks, they were living at the western end of Anatolia. That was Persian territory. They were under Persian rule. They decided they didn't like Persian rule. They rebelled. The city of Athens assisted them in that rebellion. The Persians crushed that rebellion and promised to punish Athens for helping the Ionians. And so, describe an effect of the Persian War. This was the first time that all of these independent Greek city states actually saw themselves and identified themselves as Greek. Before that, you didn't identify yourself as Greek. You identified with the city state that you were a citizen of. You weren't, Greek. You were Athenian, or you were Spartan, or you were Theban, or you were a Corinthian. So that is the big effect of the Persian Wars. Four pivotal battles of the Persian Wars. We talked about four. The first one was the Battle of Marathon. And the Battle of Marathon set the Persians back 10 years, kept them from invading again for quite some time. And in the Battle of Marathon, the Persians had landed a vast fighting force near Athens in a town called Marathon. And the Athenians, in a desperate charge, managed to kill 6,400 Persians. So they won that battle. The next was the Battle of Thermopylae. Remember the Battle of Thermopylae? That's when 300 Spartans defended a narrow pass that led from northern Greece into southern Greece. For several days, they kept a Persian army of hundreds of thousands from getting through that pass, and the Spartans fought to the last man. All 300 were killed, including their king Leonidas. Also, you had a sea battle, the Battle of Salamis, and in that battle, the Athenians managed to lure the Persian ships, which greatly outnumbered the Greek ships, into a narrow channel. And in that channel, the Persians were stuck and were not able to use their superior numbers to defeat the Greeks, and the Greeks wound up doing great damage to the Persian fleet. Remember that? And then the Battle of Plataea. The Battle of Plataea ended any chance that the Persians had to eventually conquer Greece. From the Persian War, we go over to the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War basically broke out between Athens and its allies and Sparta and its allies. So what was one cause of the Persian War? Well, it was competition. Competition for power and wealth and prestige, especially between Sparta and Athens, to the point where other city-states were feeling threatened by Athens and its Delian League, which it had formed and which it controlled. And Sparta eventually declared war on Athens. Sparta eventually won that war, but this next question, describe an effect of the Peloponnesian War. Even though Sparta won, the war weakened and impoverished all of Greece, and that gave Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, the opportunity to come down from Macedonia, invade Greece, and take over. And then describe Alexander the Great. He was a great general, never lost a battle, destroyed the Persian Empire, died at age 32, and was responsible for the spreading of Hellenism wherever he went. So that leads to this final question, and it's a big question, and it's an important question, maybe the most important question of all. What is Hellenism? Keep in mind that the Greek word for Greece is not Greece. The Greek word for Greece is Hellas, and that's where you get Hellenism. Hellenism was the spread all over this area that Alexander the Great conquered and beyond of Greek culture, Greek knowledge, Greek language, Greek values, etc. And all of this had a unifying effect on the entire region from Asia to Egypt to Europe. The fact that everybody could speak Greek facilitated trade, and with trade comes prosperity. It permitted the flow of knowledge and ideas across peoples. Alexandria in Egypt became a center of Greek knowledge. So many Jews, for example, spoke Greek that it became necessary to produce a Greek translation of their holy scripture, what we call the Old Testament. That translation, produced in Egypt by Greek and Jewish scholars, was called the Septuagint, and that translation, the Septuagint, became so popular among the Jews that that it impacted the New Testament. Greek was the original language of the New Testament because of Hellenism, even though it was written in Roman territory. And whenever the New Testament quoted the Old Testament, which is literally hundreds and hundreds of times, it quoted from the Septuagint. And so these are just some examples of how impactful Hellenism was to the history of the region, impacting us right up to this very day. So that is our review. I hope that helps. I hope that you do well on your test. Use this, listen to it 3 times, watch it, whatever, and use it also to fill out that study guide. Good luck.